Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Hey, welcome to, or welcome back to, the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey of this show that we designed to be a resource for those who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of the ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. Hey, my name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show along with Craig Brown, an industry leader and a former PLM leader at General Motors. Hey, Craig, how are you today?
I'm great, Tom. It's nice to have a new kind of guest today. We get somebody from our neck of the woods here in Detroit. And so I'm looking forward to the discussion. It's a bit more about manufacturing as opposed to engineering.
Awesome. Well, each week, Craig, we try to bring to this podcast really interesting interviews and other ideas that are going to help all the listeners enhance and grow their careers. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Today, we have James Ricci. And James is a principal at 2764 Advisors. And also, just so that you know, James is going to be one of the speakers at an upcoming event, the Leadership Seminar. It's the Journey to Industry 4.0 that's going to be brought to you by the Digital Enterprise Society and IoTco. For more information about this upcoming event, check it out at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Hey, James, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Tom and Craig. Looking forward to it.
So, James, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your career journey, what you did before and what you're doing now?
Sure. As I recently was sitting down with an old colleague from Honda where I used to work, and I realized that the arc of my career really has been tied to manufacturing, but really a lot had to do with like data and information. And I think I realized as I kind of looked back on my first job, I think I was literally doing data analytics before, we even heard that term, right? Way back in the early 90s. I did reliability analysis. I did predictive warranty work. And then stuff Tom, probably you, and more so Craig would really appreciate is I ended up getting in and doing simulation work and actually simulating vehicle assembly lines for automated guided vehicles, optimal scheduling and manning, all sorts of interesting stuff before that really became mainstream tools like they are today. My most recent type of activity now, though, is I spend a lot of time with mid-sized manufacturing firms, really trying to help them navigate sort of this industry 4.0 digital transformation, if you will, and really advising them on leveraging these tools to, quite frankly, just make themselves better.
Hey, James, this is interesting too, especially the Digital Enterprise Society, because when we evolved into our current organization, this is one of the areas we thought was way underserved or at least underrepresented, and that was the mid-sized and small manufacturers. So if I was a small manufacturer, I could imagine I'm hearing all these words, digital enterprise and data analytics and all this other stuff. And let's start with the basics. Is there a one-size-fits-all digital enterprise, or how do you help these smaller companies first get the lingo down?
Yeah, it's a good question because it can be daunting. And if most people don't realize that about 95% of all manufacturing in the United States is done by companies with fewer than 100 employees.
Right.
So when you really think about throwing something like industry jargon or an initiative like quote unquote industry 4.0 at them, it's pretty daunting. If you step back though and just say, what is a digital enterprise? At its core, there's a lot of different definitions, but it's really about some kind of sustained competitive advantage using using these digital tools from an end-to-end perspective. And, the process that they're going to have to go through is no different than a process that General Motors is going to have to go through. Mm-hmm. And ultimately it starts with a business need or some value proposition that they need to do. And that's really where you need to start. You need to start at the top and say, okay, why? So what? Why do you need to do this? And ultimately, you start with that first, with the business objectives. And that sort of begins to flesh out what makes sense to do and not do. In other words, what do you prioritize? What do you work on? And then, that lays into an implementation plan, which really needs to be approach that really, this is the tough part, is it needs to be end to end. It needs to be a life cycle approach. And so that's the piece where it becomes really difficult. You've got to incorporate people, process, technology, and then you got to go do it. And so the challenges are different for a mid-sized manufacturer, but really whether you're big or small, you have the same issues. Maybe scale becomes a bigger issue for one company. Legacy systems become a bigger issue for another company. But the fact is, they all tend to end up being too tech-focused. And that tends to be the biggest issue.
Well, and that's a good point, is it's easy to become focused on the latest tool. But any of us who've been doing this for a while, we realize that the real efficiency gains are when you can make a process change. In manufacturing, it's the flow of material on a line or out to the marketplace. But in engineering, it's the flow of information and the process of making decisions. And so I think that's one of the things I would try to help the smaller companies realize is, well, what's your critical path? You have your business objective. You want to be better than your competitor. So that's either a time to market thing or it's a cost thing. And in order to know what you should improve, you really got to know where your constraints are. One of the things that I find in the literature, and I really liked the summary out of the World Economic Forum, which I know will sound overwhelming, but they did a really interesting report about industry, the 4.0 industry revolution. And the point is, there's so many changes coming at us. Pervasive computing, the next generation has their phone at their hands all the time, not just to call somebody, but they're actually looking at information that can help them make better decisions, right? And so I think factories of the future are going to have this pervasive computing, and you would hope they have the latest data from engineering, the latest data from the field, even the latest trends on raw material pricing that might influence a decision they make. So I think if we could help you, me, from our different points of view, explain IR 4.0, I think it would help the small companies. They got to start with their critical path. And then if they ask you, suppose I had a 100-person company, well, James, what else do I need to be worried about? I mean, that thing from over in Europe was really impressive, but do I really have to worry about mobile phones and devices in my plant? What would you tell them?
that whole future proofing that you go through is a really difficult, concept to get their heads wrapped around. Because let's picture again, you're a 100-person company, could be 25, 30 million, you might be a little larger, but you're sitting there trying to get through the day and figure out, your customers of today, what they need, and you're trying to worry about 5-10 years down the road. That's pretty difficult. So the key thing is, am I making myself flexible? Am I making myself scalable to adapt to what's going on? And that's kind of what I really try to focus them on. It's like, look, we have a 5-year plan that we're putting in place. Just because that's what the plan is doesn't mean we're not going to change. But what we've got to do is put ourselves in a position to be able to react quickly to whatever's going on. And so the equipment and the processes we put in place, we need to recognize they need to be flexible and adaptable. And that tends to resonate, provided that they can get an immediate benefit, which is what some of what you were alluding to, is getting data and information that's actionable. If I buy all this really cool technology and I get all this data coming back that, like you're talking about, but then I don't do anything with it, it's really a pretty wasted investment at that point.
Well, and a lot of people do that because there's a lot of marketing dollars spent on advertising tools.
Right.
Maybe there should be more spent on advertising efficient processes. I don't know. The earlier guests have talked a bit about things like constraint management or theory of constraints, and I actually think it's some of the best material out there. The gentleman who originally did it, Goldratt, he wrote a couple novels which which made it easier for, if you will, lay people to understand. It's not about making that piece of equipment efficient just because I just bought it. It's more about, is the flow out of your factory the best it can be for the piece cost you're trying to achieve, and is it ahead of your competitors? So there are constraints. Start there. Now, you have an interesting perspective. You worked at Honda, and then you've helped these medium-sized, smaller-sized manufacturers. You know, based on that experience in the supply chain for at least auto OEMs, what should the OEMs do better with respect to digitization and their supply base?
Yeah, that's a loaded gun of a question, right? You could probably talk.
That's why I'm asking you. If I answered it, I'd get in trouble. But
yeah,
anyways.
It's a. I mean, it really does. As I look at this is one where the yin and the yang of the supply chain and the customer supplier relationship is very integrated, especially within automotive. But at the same time, there's some pretty large barriers that have been put up for competitive advantage purposes. And you could look no further than an area that people don't look at in the auto industry very closely is the tooling industry. And that's one where you see communication and digital tools really break down as information and data gets passed from an OEM to a supplier, and a supplier such as, let's say, Flex and Gate, to just illustratively speaking, to a tooling supplier who gets data to make a tool. And
I want to help the audience. Tooling in this context means?
This means literally the manufactured thing that makes the part itself. So in other words, it's not the part that you see on the car. It's not the plastic part on the car. It's the actual tool that, that actually forms the plastic part that goes on the car.
So fixtures and molds and presses. Correct. And all the other stuff like that.
Stamping dies, plastic injection molds, you name it, die casting tools. And you really see wrong data being transferred, improper data being transferred, quite frankly, a design that's impossible to build being transferred. And if you take all of that to its to its conclusion, the reality is somewhere in the future, you're going to have a situation where a 3D part drawing is going to get created, and the tool itself, the plastic injection molded tool, will automatically be designed. The routing to manufacture that tool will automatically be created. The CAM programming that may be required for additive or subtractive manufacturing will be done, and it will be processed directly to some sort of multi-process manufacturing cell to be made. That's where Industry 4.0 is going to be at some point. But today, it's not there. And the OEMs and the suppliers play a big role in that because of how data and information is or isn't shared for competitive reasons, quite frankly.
Well, and that's a really good piece of insight, because a lot of the small companies, they work for different car companies who are competitors, right? Conversely, the big car companies, we tend to have multiple suppliers, sometimes even of the same part. And so, of course, the maybe unique knowledge we would get from one supplier cannot be shared with another supplier of that same kind of fixture or tool. So that's interesting. Is we got to work better on the exchanges. While we're at it, why don't we talk about the tool, or we call them solution providers? What can they do better to help this? Is it just a matter of standards, or is there something else they should do?
Sure, standards are a big deal. One of the piece I see the biggest miss or need, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, is around the change management aspect. I look at it as, technology's changing exponentially, people change logarithmically. So
that's interesting.
And so
you have to explain that to the broader audience, but that's really interesting.
So if you picture, I'm an engineer, you picture an XY graph, and you picture an exponential curve, and you picture a logarithmic, and they don't intersect. One goes, high and hard, the other one goes out wide and to the right. Mm-hmm. And the middle area is significant risk. And what happens is the the technology providers sell you on the technology. But the change management, the people piece of that gets lost. And I've been in situations where I won't use names to protect the innocent, but they put in this, one of my clients put in some machine monitoring software. And we're talking about machines, by the way, that on average cost over $1 million, 5-axis CNC machines to be put in place. And somehow myself, as a support person to their organization, became the resident expert on the software. And that's fundamentally flawed. I'm like, who should look? These things give us alerts when they're down. They tell us why they're down. Who's looking at this information? Why am I the one looking at this information? And it was because the technology provider didn't train the CNC manager and the VP of operations on how to use this and how to train their people to use it. And then for them, how are you changing your processes, your metrics, right, so that it's integrated into what you do day in and day out? Because if it's important to you, it'll be important to them.
Yeah, this is a really good point, that there are examples like this across the board where, and then usually it's a short-term focus. They buy a new tool, they think they're going to get this big benefit. Maybe the training's poor, in the example you just gave, or even other organizational issues. So when you said change management, I want to make clear to the audience, we're talking about the harder part of this, which is the organization change management. Knowing that you need to fill a position, fitting that position into your current company the way it's supposed to work better. These are things that are typically missed. And, it's one of my pet peeves is how often this happens. And to be fair to the solution provider, technically it's not their fault.
Right.
But then maybe it is their responsibility to help explain, well, once you get this new tool, here's the change you're going to have to go through in your company. And it might be an organizational change, and it might be a process change. And, by the way, if you do it, though, you'll get these huge benefits. And I think they sell features, they don't sell benefits. And maybe that's part of the problem, right?
Well, and there's also an element of, with these new technologies, I use the term, there's new competencies that are required in potentially in an organization, or the competencies are required by people in existing positions and they don't have them. So either you need to train them into that, or you need to bring those skills into your organization through another individual or set of individuals. And so that piece of it is, again, often missed. And that's where, like, you can, if done properly, you can bring in the younger generation, the younger workforce. They can fill that competency need and really, wrong term, but prop up maybe those managers that don't necessarily have the technical skill to totally leverage the tools, but they know that they can empower the workforce below them to properly leverage the tools so that they can be successful.
Now, James, at the beginning, you said something really interesting about data analytics, and early in your career, you were the data analytics guy, trying to make sense of what was going on. Today, in the popular language, everybody's talking about becoming a data scientist and data analytics. And I guess my observation is, and I'm curious what you think, is I'm not sure the job of analyzing the data is different. It's just much, much faster, right? And it's partly because computers can help you do pattern matching now that you used to do on your own through your own Excel spreadsheets, right?
Right.
And so now you can draw conclusions at least quicker, and maybe even different conclusions. Do you agree, or do you think there's other things in data analytics that might happen that would help the small manufacturers?
Yeah, see, this is where like a General Motors would differ from a small, mid-sized manufacturer. Like those data scientists, the breadth of data that GM's trying to tie together between production and sales is pretty complex. And you're right, the new systems allow you to, I use the term rabbit holes. You can go down a lot of rabbit holes in a short period of time. And that's great, because a lot of times you're like, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? And like 8 hours later, you find out, well, you know what, there's no pattern there, but I just used a day of my time. That was a big waste.
Right.
Now, those systems allow you to do that all the time. And they can find, to your point, patterns that you would never even have thought of. What I still find, though, it gets lost, at least in manufacturing, is context. It's very difficult for machines and really, quite frankly, inexperienced data analysts to know, is that an outlier or is that really a reasonable scrap value or a reasonable number? And sometimes it's actually looks like it should be an outlier when in fact, when you put it in context of the company, what they do, what their strategy is, that's a real number. And that often gets lost in the shuffle of doing this, the analytics. And what you need is you need to know that, have that knowledge. And I look back on my time at Honda, and that's what they did. They put an engineer in a position to solve a problem, but they said, here's all the data and information, here's all the manufacturing, go forth and figure it out, kid. And you were in a position where you had all the data, but you had the context of the data because they trained you to go and see. And that piece gave you context that data alone can't give you.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of insight. And context gets lost. We've had a few guests last summer that talked about the importance of configuration management, and a synonym for that would be context. Know the context that you're trying to make a decision in. It was kind of fascinating. These guys were in the machines that build chips. So it was interesting to hear them talk about how they do their job. But it's the same kind of thing. If you don't have the context, you can't make the decisions. So, James, I learned about you, and you and I are doing this podcast partly as an event that Thom mentioned earlier that's coming up here in the spring. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about at this event?
Absolutely, yeah, because I'm really excited by this, because this goes back to this idea that you want to give back, and you want to help people in this journey, because this is, again, we talked about this, Industry 4.0, where do you start? It's really different for every company. Based on that business need. But when you get the brass tacks, a lot of people are like, what is it that you did first? Like, can you show me something? Like, how did you do this? And for us, we want to use this event to kind of make it real for people. We're going to, real plants, real case studies, real challenges, real data, real information, what I'm calling practical education. So this isn't about, let's talk about theories of what you need to do. Let us show you what is the art of the possible. This is already up and running. Someone's doing predictive quality. Okay. They're actually looking at equipment and going, I'm going to create a defect in the next 5 cycles. How did they figure that out?
Right.
Like, that always applies. Or vice versa. Hey, guess what? Who has trouble finding a maintenance guy? Raise your hand. Finding a skilled trade maintenance person, and every person's going to raise their hand and go, wouldn't it be great if when they go to do a PM that they didn't have to replace all 7 bearings,
right?
That the equipment would tell them, you only need to replace this one. And oh, by the way, it's not going to fail for another 3 weeks. So schedule it within the next 3 weeks. Wouldn't that be incredibly helpful for you to know? And and that type of information we want to bring practical examples, because somebody walks away and goes, that's a universal problem. I'd love to know about quality before it happens. I'd love to know about a maintenance failure before it occurs. And
to me, that's the promise of the prognostics that's imminent, right? And for everybody listening, this is already being done in products you use every day. Some cases you don't know about it. But your bearing example is a really interesting one. You could even reduce the duty cycle. If you're having a slope in sales, we'll stop producing as many parts, just produce fewer parts, run it at a lower operating temperature or something. And maybe you can make it last even longer, right? While you're waiting for the repair guy to show up. It's interesting to know the dynamics of what will cause the failure. It's a combination of duty cycle and operating conditions, as well as the wear in this case. So it's really fascinating. Well, I look forward to your talk, and I hope lots of people join us. Details are coming. And Thom, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks a lot. So James, before we kind of got started, we did talk about this whole idea, and you just mentioned it when you were talking about your talk at this conference, about, you've reached a place in your career where giving back is important. And one of the things I love to do with the guests who are on the show is we can talk about the technology and everything that everybody's doing, but I like to take it down to the individual listener. What career advice do you have for somebody? You had a really interesting stat that most people who work in manufacturing, or most jobs, are in companies with less than 100 people. So let's assume for a second we have listeners who are working for these smaller manufacturing companies. What career advice do you have?
Great question. And I think about this a lot. And we get into this debate within the US at least about should you go to college or not go to college? and to me, that's an interesting question, but that may not be the right question to always ask. The thing that I push forward is, look, it doesn't matter whether you go to college or not. You are in a lifelong learning and education mode. This idea that you stop after high school, stop after an undergraduate, that doesn't work. You need to continually reinvent yourself and grow your competencies, grow your capabilities. And so I use the term, you need to be multi-skilled. So in other words, think about yourself in the shape of a T, okay? So, people often talk about, are you narrow? There you go. You're narrow and broad, or narrow and deep, or are you broad and shallow? And I say you need to be both. You need to be technically deep in an area, but you need to be broad across a lot of areas. And that's what small companies need, because a large company like General Motors, they can have somebody specialize. It's very difficult in an organization of maybe 100 people to have someone who can only do one thing. So the more multi-skilled you are, quite frankly, the more valuable you are to an organization. Conversely, you might be a little more frantic at your job at times because you feel like you wear a lot of hats. But the reality is that's the thing I put forward. You be multidisciplinary, be multi-skilled. That's a huge asset to have in an organization.
Well, and one of the things
I think that's excellent, James. We've had this come up a few times now about naturally curious, right? If you find yourself being in that very small field and very deep in it, well, that's great. But if you're not curious how you fit into the rest of the enterprise, regardless of size, you're probably not as valuable to yourself or to your company. So you're right, lifelong education and stay curious.
Well, and people who are curious tend to be people who listen to more podcasts. That's what they've shown is curious people are going to be looking for ways to learn. So therefore, we're preaching to the choir a little bit because our audience already falls into that curious area. But when you and Craig were talking, you were talking a little bit about like equipment. You were talking about something about equipment needing to be flexible and adaptable. The people have to be flexible and adaptable as well.
Absolutely.
I heard recently, we talk a lot about capital in the financial side about, investing in equipment. And I was reading a book recently about organizational capital. And just a reminder to everybody listening, you too are a piece of the machinery that runs a manufacturing company. Organizational capital, the people and the processes and the knowledge is every bit as important as the machine capital. The investments you have to make to go buy something that you don't make yourself. And so my point is when you're in a discussion talking about capital, remind the people in the discussion, there's other capital, there's organizational capital, there's what each of us can bring in terms of our knowledge. It's actually one of the things that makes you very competitive.
Good advice. So James, any last words?
The last piece I will say is I always plug manufacturing, and the idea that is we live in this state. I live in the Detroit area, so there's a lot of auto here and auto there. But at the end of the day, I always try to go back. Just remember, I tell everybody I can, everything you look at, everything you see, somebody had to make it. And it may not be a large portion of the U.S. population these days, around 9%, but it's critically important to this country. So I encourage everybody to be involved in that part of the industry, or that part of the economy.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and being here on the show. And thanks to everybody who tuned in and listened. We hope that you will join us every single week as we bring you more thoughts, ideas, and information in and around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society, it is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. And so jump over to digitalenterprisesociety.org. And while you're there, look for the information on the upcoming conference, which is going to be the leadership seminar, The Journey to Industry 4.0. And you can hear James speak. Thanks, everybody.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.